Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles issues affecting your rights and matters of legal recourse. My name is Dumila Matez. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion today by tweeting us at Rights Recourse or calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498. Alternatively, you can email your thoughts to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. The case of Hissène Habré has been pushed from domestic to regional to international courts and back. But the former president of Chad is yet to answer the serious allegations that have been leveled against him. However, after concerted efforts by a number of actors, not least civil society, which has refused to relent in its call for justice, it appears that the victims of Habré's alleged crimes will soon have their day in court. Attempts to bring him to justice began in 2000 when some of the victims lodged complaints against him with a senior investigating judge in Senegal, who swiftly indicted Habré and having aided and abetted crimes against humanity and acts of torture, barbarity, and placed him under house arrest. On Monday, July the 20th, Hissène Habré's trial started in Dakar, Senegal. Today on Rights and Recourse, after the Omar al-Bashir episode, when the African Union announced its own processes in pursuance of justice in Africa, the arrest of President Hissène Habré could be seen as a fulfillment of that promise. Let us first watch this insert with visuals courtesy of Human Rights Watch.
When we first began this case 16 years ago, one of the victims asked us, "Since when has justice come all the way to Chad?"
Comment Hissène Habré va nier qu'il n'a pas tué des gens? La 404 jaune bâchée, ça servait à quoi? À amener de la viande? Moi j'étais là, si on t'appelle entre 1h du matin jusqu'à 3h30, c'est pour l'exécution. Mais si c'est après 3h30, c'est pour les tortures.
Moi, quand mon mari était arrêté, personne n'est venu me rendre visite. Même dans la rue, je dis bonjour, ils fuient, ils ne veulent pas se rapprocher de moi. Parce que dès qu'ils vont rapprocher, ils vont dire, ah, ils vont venir peut-être me dire les nouvelles. Ils seront arrêtés.
Hissène Habré was the dictator of Chad from 1982 to 1990. He's accused of thousands of political killings and systematic torture.
Après lui, il régnait comme un dieu. Pour lui, tout ce qui bouge vient contre son pouvoir. Celui qui ose, Habré est un lion, il va le dévorer.
The Documentation and Security Directorate, the DDS, was like Hissène Habré's personal Gestapo.
La DDS pouvait fusiller quelqu'un, et la DDS pouvait égorger quelqu'un, la DDS pouvait enterrer quelqu'un vivant, mais la DDS était permis à faire tout.
Souleymane Gengeng spent almost 3 years in Hissène Habré's prisons, and he saw dozens of prisoners die around him. He swore to God that if he ever survived, that he would devote his life to the pursuit of justice. When they were released from prison, Souleymane and other victims interviewed hundreds of survivors and relatives and prepared their files. And it was these files that were the basis for the first indictment of Hissène Habré in Senegal in 2000. I was in Chad with my colleague Olivier Berco in 2001, and we went to the abandoned offices of the DDS. And there we stumbled on rooms and rooms of documents. Lists of prisoners who died every day, spying reports, interrogation files. This was a roadmap to how Hissène Habré carried out the repression of his people. Human Rights Watch has been working with Habré's victims for 16 years. It's because of the perseverance of the victims who never gave up that Hissène Habré is going to trial. We have hundreds of victims' testimonies. We have the documents of the DDS that corroborate those testimonies. And then we have the testimony of the people around Hissène Habré who describe how Habré's orders were carried out.
Je disais toujours aux gens que nous, en tant que survivants de torture, il nous manque quelque chose. De tout ce qu'on a vécu, vraiment, il n'y a que cette justice qui devait nous donner la vraie guérison psychologique. Hein? Parce que pour quelqu'un qui n'a pas vécu cette prison, qui n'a pas vécu ces tortures, ne peut pas les comprendre.
When I met Souleymane Gengeng for the first time, people thought he was crazy to pursue justice against the dictator. This trial could be historic for Chad and for Africa, to show that ordinary victims, through perseverance and tenacity, can bring a dictator to justice.
Well, courtesy of Human Rights Watch, that insert there, as you heard the word DDS. It stands for the Direction de la Documentation de la Sécurité, the Directorate of Documentation for Security. To discuss this topic are Professor Mia Swart from International Law from the University of Johannesburg, and from our Pretoria studio we are joined by Otilia Maunganidze, Research on International Criminal Justice, Counterterrorism and Transnational Threats and International Crime Division of the Institute for Security Studies. Ladies, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Thank you, Dumile.
Probably a question we should ask Otilia is, who is this man, Hissène Habré? Otilia, did you hear me?
I did. In short, Hissène Habré is the former president of Chad. Between 1982 and 1990, he served as the country's president. And during that time, as you heard from the Human Rights Watch report, there was quite a lot of crimes that were committed under his rule. After he was deposed on 1 December 1990, he fled to Senegal, where he has been in exile since.
Why would somebody who has committed these kind of crimes stay in Senegal for 24 years and only have to be pursued after 24 years?
Well, I think the first part of your question is really interesting. You know, not many people have thought about it this way. Why would he not, flee to South America, for example? And it is actually an indictment in itself of the criminal justice system in African countries, that so far there's been such a large measure of impunity that people feel safe. They don't think there is, a high likelihood that they would get prosecuted. They feel they would be protected by their friends. They know that the laws, certainly at that point there was no ICC, so he thought that Senegal wouldn't prosecute him. And the one time they tried, they didn't convict him. They said, oh, but those crimes weren't committed on our territory. So he must have felt so safe, and it's as a result of impunity. Sorry, and the second part of your question was, why is he now being prosecuted? Sorry, was that the second
Yes, that's the question.
Yes.
After 24 years staying in Senegal.
Okay, so we know that these kinds of international crimes don't prescribe, It's not like an ordinary murder where maybe after a certain amount of years you can't prosecute anymore. With these kinds of crimes, there is no time limit of this kind. And as we just heard, the victims kept agitating for justice. For all these years, the victims wouldn't let it go, and Reed Brody of Human Rights Watch was also a major force, to keep persisting in this matter, which is very good, and that is why we're now seeing the trial.
Otilia, the fact that this man has been brought to trial in Senegal is probably testimony to what the African Union has been saying, that they are going to create their own processes of bringing people like President Hissène Habré to justice.
I think we have to be pragmatic in responding to that, because the first thing is that, as you've already pointed out, it's taken 25 years since Hissène Habré was deposed for any processes to begin. Importantly, he hasn't yet been prosecuted, and his trial has been postponed until September, when it will actually hopefully commence. So in terms of the creation of special courts to deal with these crimes, in many ways it is a long way coming. Could they have done something sooner? Yes. Did they? They didn't do that. But quite importantly, the message here is, hopefully, no matter how long since the time you committed your crimes, justice can be done. Ideally, it should be done sooner, but now we're seeing it at least happening at a continental level with the support of the African Union.
The other thing, Mia, is the fact that apparently when he was deposed and Idris Deby came into power, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission similar to ours. And that Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually revealed all of these things.
Right. But of course, it doesn't follow that there'll be a prosecution. I mean, after the South African TRC, you know, many countries have followed our model, but very often it's seen as a substitute for justice, or very often there's this feeling that you don't need prosecutions or criminal justice. You've now had a sort of a, you know, attempt to deal with it, but it doesn't even mean that the politicians are serious and have the political will to actually, you know, follow the criminal justice process and convict people.
I was actually apparently. Oh, you want to come in? No, come in, Ottilia.
Yes, I was going to say if I can come in at that point. Even though there was a process in Chad, firstly, Hissène Habré fled to Senegal before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happened. What actually happened domestically in Senegal is that in 2008, he was convicted in absentia for the crimes that he allegedly committed during that time. But as you know, internationally, trials in absentia are not generally regarded as proper processes. So while he was prosecuted in his absence and incidentally convicted and sentenced to death, he is obviously still in Senegal, and those processes in Chad couldn't happen properly because he wasn't in Chad.
The other question that concerns me around this issue has been the fact that this man, I read somewhere that he was part of the rebel movement against a former government, and he was brought into government and made the prime minister and turned on his comrades. How do you reconcile those two? Probably both of you can give me something on that.
Well, we know that he was, you know, heavily supported by the United States in his, you know, sort of struggle against Gaddafi and other regional powers that they, you know, didn't like. So I think that played a part in him, you know, strategically deciding that he's going to take on that position. I don't know if Ottilia has any ideas about that.
Right. I think quite importantly, Hissène Habré, before he became president, he had served as prime minister. He was removed from office 3 years before he eventually then led a coup that resulted in him being president. So his history within Chad was one of wanting to be in power, and then he was able to get that power. But obviously, as we've already been talking about, during his term in office, there was a lot of criticism of his term in office, but because he received quite a significant amount of support from then President Ronald Reagan's administration in the United States, but then also from France, he was able to stay in power for the time that he remained in power. And then he was only eventually deposed himself by way of another coup by the current president.
That's interesting that the Americans were supporting Hissène Habré. Why would they support Hissène Habré? Probably they would have. I don't know whether my theory is right. Both of you can either refute my theory. My theory is America had a problem with Muammar Gaddafi, and they use Chadian airspace to attack installations in Libya. That could be true, and they used Hissène Habré to do that.
Yes. Well, of course, it's not unusual for the US to do this, to fight sort of proxy wars in other countries. You know, they supported movements in Latin America as well. It's just that later on, you know, they claim not to have been involved, and there's never any accountability for their involvement. So I think that is something that needs a lot more attention. Yeah.
Ottilia, in my research, you wanted to say something there. I must actually check that you wanted to say. You can come in and talk.
Yes, I did. I think quite importantly, you have to recognize the time at which this was happening. This was during the waning years of the Cold War, and as Mia rightly pointed out, it was during a time of proxy wars that were fought, mostly, on the African continent and elsewhere. And so Chad was a geostrategic place, not only for the United States, but also for France at the time.
Well, when we come back, we are going to talk about the involvement of Belgium in trying to pursue justice against Hissène Habre. If you'd like to join us on today's discussion, please call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Recourse. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are discussing the trial of President Hissène Habre, former president of Chad, in Senegal, in Dakar, Senegal. The question I wanted to ask Ottilia and Mia is, of all countries, Belgium were interested in seeing that justice brought for the victims. Why Belgium?
Yes, well, Belgium has actually tried that before. In the early 2000s, Belgium tried to prosecute the foreign minister of the Congo, Yerodia, for crimes against humanity committed in the Congo. And then one can ask the same question, what was their business in the Congo? So
well, we can understand. I think at some stage the Congo was like a farm to King Leopold.
Yes, of course, so they had a business then. But the point is that Belgium's universal jurisdiction laws were very permissive and very wide and allowed them to carry out these kinds of prosecutions. And they actually also were adventurous enough to implement these universal jurisdiction laws, which, allows one country to prosecute a leader, from another country, even if the crimes weren't committed, on Belgian territory, or if the victims weren't Belgian. And this actually led to a lot of criticism from the international community, and universal jurisdiction in that form hasn't actually worked very well. But again, since Habre's crimes were committed before the establishment of the ICC, Belgium thought, this is one forum at least, this is one way of holding him accountable. So it was one of many attempts to hold him accountable, and I think it's good that Belgium interfered in that way. So, Ottilia, yeah.
Yes, Ottilia, I see you're burning to say something.
I am. It's a pity I can't see you. But just to clarify one thing, when the processes in Belgium were first initiated, it was by way of victims from Chad who were living in Belgium. Now, in invoking its universal jurisdiction in that regard, it was basing it on the fact that a party to the proceedings, in this case the victims, were themselves Chadian. The issue obviously came into play as to whether they would be able to investigate the crimes committed in Chad, but also importantly whether the people that were in Chad, in Belgium, at the time, were the direct victims of Hissène Habre's rule during the time. So what ended up happening really was that through that process, firstly, the voice of victims was finally heard. because what had been going on for 15 years was that people were speculating about the crimes that were committed and wondering who would prosecute Hissène Habré. And then the victims, perhaps because it had been so long while they were waiting for something to happen, they sought relief from a Belgian court. Of course, then Belgium sought his extradition from Senegal, and that is the process that began all of what we are now seeing today. Had those victims not come forward, it's likely that we might not have been seeing a prosecution of Hissène Habré beginning now in 2015.
It would, however, seem, Mia, that the efforts of Belgium were frustrated by both the United States and the government of both President Diop and President Abdoulaye Wade in Senegal. And Wade actually went to an extent of appointing Hissène Habré's lawyer as his advisor, but allowed him to defend Habré still.
Right. I'm not too familiar with that background. Maybe Ottilia can help on that kind of factual background.
Ottilia, do you want to venture?
No, yes, definitely I can. I think one of the key issues there, and this is something that historically the United States, for example, has always had an issue with the concept of universal jurisdiction. And so their lack of support initially for processes against people like Hissène Habré were informed by that. But obviously there has been a shift, a significant shift with the current American administration that has moved away from the position that was held by the George Bush administration. When it comes to the support that Abdoulaye Wade offered rather to Hissène Habré, it has a lot to do with the question you asked earlier around why would Hissène Habré go to Senegal? Right? During that time, he enjoyed the support of other states in Africa. So forget the United States and France for a moment. He did enjoy support on the continent. And so for him to flee to Senegal, one, he knew that he would be safe and that he would be that he wouldn't be prosecuted. And that assurance obviously lasted for as long as it has. And as we know now, Abdoulaye Wade is no longer the president of Senegal, and now we're seeing efforts towards his prosecution.
Yes, the president of Senegal today is Macky Sall. I want to go back to something that I picked up in the research, that when he left into exile, he took the whole of the treasury with him. Therefore, he had money to flaunt around and pay his way not to be prosecuted.
Right. Well, that's probably, you know, what happens very often. I mean, that makes the world go round, right? It's just interesting that they claim that they're indigent when it comes to, you know, investigations into the assets of, say, Charles Taylor. You know, there was a claim that he had absolutely nothing, that he was indigent, you know, and that they can't even pay their own legal representation. Yes.
I always have to ask whether you want to venture out.
But he has been, up until at least 2005, he was living fairly within the lap of luxury in Dakar. And then when he was put under house arrest, that was when the state of his finances actually came to light, because now he's being put under house arrest in a fairly comfortable sort of upper middle class house. So then people were awakened to the fact that he was living comfortably in Dakar.
I was intrigued by the interest of the Americans in Chad until I came across something that said to me, Chad is rich in uranium deposits. Ottilia?
Rich in uranium and also oil. So I think you've posed a question, but I think it's rhetorical, Dumile.
Yes, it is. The one other thing probably one should ask. You spoke earlier, Mia, about the broad the broad judiciary system of the Belgians. And apparently Belgium was in pursuit of highly ranking Americans, and the Americans actually asked Belgium to lessen to change its laws, its judiciary laws, and Belgium actually relented.
Yes, well, actually, initially they had this absolute universal jurisdiction model, Belgium, which meant that they could prosecute anybody anywhere, you know, even if the victims weren't in Belgium. And then they actually amended that law to require some jurisdictional link. So Ottilia explained the jurisdictional link, which is that the Chadian victims, some of them were actually in Belgium and initiated the case. But in terms of the US pressure, it's not strange to me. I mean, all the talk around arresting Bush, arresting Cheney, you know, etc., is just going to remain talk. There is not going to be sufficient political will to actually achieve that, you know. So,
Ottilia, quickly, I want to go to something else. Despite the fact that the AU has taken such a keen interest in this case, human rights organizations are unanimous that this was pursued largely by the victims of Houston Harbor.
That's definitely true. So while the AU has now lent its support towards a prosecution of Hissène Habré, this is something, the question that would always be asked is, if they were of the view that there needs to be a prosecution of Hissène Habré, why did it take so long for the process to begin? But importantly, why did it take the victims coming forward to say, please do something for them to act? But then also, since about 2010, the AU has said that they will work towards the establishment of an extraordinary chamber in Senegal. 2010 was 5 years ago, and we're only seeing now this chamber actually starting to operate. So there's the question, obviously, on the one hand of commitment, but also on actions towards commitment.
You've mentioned on a number of occasions, you spoke about international jurisdiction. What is this international jurisdiction?
You mean universal jurisdiction?
Universal jurisdiction, yes.
Okay. Well, that simply means that jurisdiction isn't tied to a particular territory, but that a state can, in certain circumstances, for example, when international crimes were committed, you know, prosecute crimes that were committed in another state, because the international community has an interest as a whole to prosecute certain very serious crimes. That is why, you know, in my view, Habré didn't have to be prosecuted in Senegal. He could be prosecuted in another state as well. Any state, you know, should actually feel that it can exercise its jurisdiction in the case of such severe crimes.
So how different is that from, okay, you can go ahead.
Perhaps to clarify for the viewers, normally in order for a country to have jurisdiction over crimes, the person who would have committed the crime would need to be in that country, and also the victims, for example, right? So then they would be able to invoke jurisdiction on the basis of the nationality of the person who committed the crimes and or the nationality of the victims. When it comes to universal jurisdiction, for example, where the crime was committed elsewhere and the victims themselves are not, using South Africa as an example, are not South African, and the person who committed the crime is not South African, universal jurisdiction allows for you to be able to prosecute such a person and not just extradite them, which is what often tends to happen where there is no universal jurisdiction.
The question I wanted to ask earlier was, why is he being tried in Senegal? I know the International Court of Justice was interested in this case.
Right.
Why is it not tried by the ICC, for instance?
Okay, well, the simple reason there is that the crimes were committed before the establishment of the ICC, and the ICC only prosecutes prospectively. In other words, it only prosecutes cases that, you know, occurred after 1998, after the signing of the Rome Statute. So these crimes, you know, wouldn't qualify. So that's why the lawyers had to look to different fora. The ICJ isn't perfect because the ICJ, you know, doesn't actually have the teeth to punish somebody in the sense that an international criminal tribunal would, right? To actually imprison someone. And the ICJ hears cases between states and isn't an ideal forum for an individual war criminal, because it's not interested in individuals, it's interested in states.
I was also intrigued, okay. All right, go ahead. I think I should anticipate.
Sorry.
I should anticipate that you want to say something on all of these points.
Yes, the International Court of Justice does not have prosecutorial jurisdiction at all. And that's a very important thing to always remember, that while the International Court of Justice, as Mia correctly points out, deals with disputes between states and can offer advisory opinions, it cannot prosecute anyone. The International Criminal Court, again, only has jurisdiction from 1 July 2002, not 1998, when the Rome Statute came into force. And so whether the ICC would have wanted to deal with the matter, it wouldn't have been able to. And that's the same situation that happened, for example, with the prosecutions around the conflict in Sierra Leone, where Charles Taylor was convicted. That special court for Sierra Leone was established after the ICC actually came into being, but because it was dealing with crimes that were committed before 1 July 2002, it couldn't be dealt with by the ICC and instead was dealt with by the Special Court for Sierra Leone.
Well, we'll continue talking about this case, the trial of President Jason Harborough. If you'd like to join us, you can call us on 011-714-5497 or 5498 or tweet us at Rights Recourse. Stay with us.
Vincent Bones, the man with silky vocals that had many viewers captivated from his very first audition, now holds the title of King of South African Idols Season 10.
I came from the streets, so I was a bit rough. So when I got to Boys Town, I started teaching myself playing piano with two fingers. Well, that's how I started with music. So I started getting interested in piano, and then I stared singing.
He's a loving father, loving husband, and he makes us happy.
Bophelong, your show about those who took on and conquered life's challenges, every Saturday at 17:30 CAT.
Welcome back. You are still watching Rights and Recourse as we discuss the trial of President Jason Harborough of Chad, the former president of Chad, I should say. But what I do not know, I think we have been unfair on probably on President Abdoulaye Wade, because President Abdoulaye Wade did say on the 19th of September 2005, on 27th of September 2001, if a country can organize a fair trial and wants him, they should speak to Germany. She would see, and Germany would approach him. Belgium would approach him. Yeah. He will have no obstacles in the case. Was that a generous statement to make by Abdoulaye Wade? Did he want to see his friend?
It's very unlikely. I mean, again, Otilia asked the question, why did it take so long? So that sounds like a statement that was made more out of bravado than a serious intention to prosecute.
Attilia, first, okay, go ahead.
Under house arrest 4 years later, after that statement was made. So he wasn't put under house arrest immediately, but rather after other processes were initiated.
The question also that comes to mind, we have spoken about, I have mentioned the fact what charges is he facing, but the charges I have read in my research are too wide and too broad.
Well, the nature of the international crimes for which he's charged, they are in many ways, you could say they're broad because they are categories of crimes, so they're crimes against humanity. And they really relate to him allegedly ordering that these crimes be carried out, or in his own way helping to facilitate that the crimes be carried out. So unlike, for example, on a domestic level where you charge a person for a murder that they directly committed, with crimes against humanity, for example, it could be that the person is charged for ordering the torture of people or ordering that they be killed.
there's a strong argument by human rights organizations that there is an accountability gap in international law and allows the perpetrators of some of the most abhorrent international crimes to go unpunished and let them live out the rest of their lives in relative comfort. Is that the case here? We've seen that happen with Mariam Mengistu, the former president of Ethiopia in Zimbabwe.
Yes, of course it's the case, because if this wasn't the case, we would see many more heads of state and former heads of state being arrested and actually put on trial. And the mere fact that it was so difficult for the South African, courts to persuade government that al-Bashir needed to be arrested, that this was such a controversy, also indicates that, this is not what usually happens. It was seen as exceptional, There's too much political protection, not enough political will, and in Africa, the situation is pretty dire. Even with the ICC functioning, we don't see trials going smoothly. We don't see more people being convicted because we don't get states cooperating the way they should be cooperating. You can think of the Kenyan example it's a recent example.
And importantly, the impunity gap that a lot of organizations speak about is not just about prosecuting people like Isenabre. The question that can be raised is, all the people that are alleged to have been commanded by Isenabre to carry out these crimes, have they been prosecuted? So in seeking justice, it's about seeking justice for the ones right at the top, but also for the ones who carried out the acts, so ensuring that there is no gap whatsoever. And I think the problem here is, even if Isenabre is prosecuted, and even if he is convicted, the question is whether the people who carried out the crimes on the ground as well have been brought to justice.
Let's take this call from Zugila from Bloemfontein. Zugila, good afternoon. Welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Hello.
Hello, Zugila. Are you there? Yes, sir. What is your question? What's your point? Are you there? Seems not to be there. He got cold feet, perhaps. Let's go to something else that I wanted to ask you guys. Is this trial a litmus test for African justice, as some analysts are saying?
Yes, well, I would say so. That was my argument recently in the Sunday Times, because it's the first domestic prosecution of a head of state. Well, it's a former head of state, but still someone of that seniority. And this is actually what we want to see. We want to see trials that take place in domestic states in Africa. That is preferable to the ICC system. Even though I'm a supporter of the ICC system, domestic courts should develop, the capacity and expertise to engage in these kinds of prosecutions. Otherwise, it doesn't help that we have law on international crimes, that we have, conventions, etc. We need to implement it on the domestic level. There it also has the biggest symbolic value to show to the population. It also has supposed to have deterrent value, and it shows that the justice system, has this sort of, it's infused with these moral principles that if you commit the worst crimes, like torture, for example, torture is a crime of the most serious sort of, it's really one of the most serious crimes. In South Africa, we've sometimes not prosecuted people for torture. What sort of message does that send out, right? So I hope the South African government watches this trial very closely, because I think this puts us to shame.
Before I know you are about to say something, but let's take this call again from Zugila. Zugila, good afternoon, and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Good afternoon, sir. You've got quite an interesting topic there today.
Thank you very much.
And I so wish that it can be a topic that can become an international debate, especially in the African continent.
Thank you very much. What's your comment now?
My comment it's around the issue of the capacity of the African Union with regard to the charging and the possible prosecution of these dictators who have eliminated innocent people. My question is whether is there a real will in the African leaders to do so? Because so far we haven't really came across any outcome, any results pertaining to all these dictators other than your likes of Americans, French and British coming in and invade for their own personal agendas. The question that arises is, do we have a will as African leaders really to take charge of our own continent and to deal decisively with the problems that are facing our continent?
Thank you very much, Zweli Zugila. My apologies, I said you're from Bloemfontein. Looks like you're from the Eastern Cape. Let me go back to you. You wanted to make a comment on what Mia said earlier, or add to what Mia said earlier.
Yes, I did. And, you know, there are people who are regarding this extraordinary chamber in the courts in Senegal as a litmus test for African justice. I'm inclined to disagree, because this is not a Senegalese domestic prosecution in the sense of, for example, the Gauteng division of the High Court here in South Africa dealing with the matter. This is a specially created court to deal with a particular case related to Isenabre, and it is a special division of the court that has been established with the support of the Economic Community of West African States as well as the African Union. That is not a normal court. And the issue here is, will this court, and as it currently is, it won't be dealing with any other prosecutions other than that of Isenabre. So will Senegalese courts be dealing with the commission of international crimes by Senegalese people, but also any other cases that might arise? That is ultimately what will be the litmus test. And I do feel, obviously, there's quite a lot in terms of attention on the Isenabre case. But if you look at efforts that are being done in the Democratic Republic of the Congo with the mobile gender justice courts to deal with sexual violence, that's a litmus test. If you look at the establishment of the International Crimes Division of the High Courts in Uganda, which are entirely staffed by Ugandans and are as an effort of the Ugandan government, that's a litmus test, because they will be dealing with Ugandan cases. They haven't as yet managed to prosecute international crimes, but they are currently doing a prosecution of those alleged to be responsible for the terrorist attacks in 2010. Those are domestic processes. I don't regard Isenabre's prosecution as an entirely Senegalese process. It's a process supported by the African Union. And then to respond to what Zukile said, and he raises a very important point, which is around political will that goes beyond rhetoric. And I think with the African Union, even though they have now adopted a protocol to establish an African court that will deal with international crimes, within that statute what they've said is that they will not hold to account people who are senior government officials or heads of state during their term in office. That might seem like a good idea, except then it could also encourage people to not leave office and instead choose to hold on to power. That might be a problem in the future.
You wanted to say something around a number of things Ottilia has mentioned. One of them I would like you to tackle is her last sentence. It might make people stay in power for longer for fear of being taken to court if they are no more presidents.
Right. Okay, so my initial point was just on the point of dispute between me and her, that I do think this is a test case. I don't think the test for a test case is whether it's purely domestic. I think the question is rather, to an extent, what is the level of international attention? And the level of international attention on the Heartbreak case is particularly high. The domestic courts in Uganda has actually failed to successfully prosecute so far. So if this works, you know, it will send a message that there is at least some African model, even though it's not purely domestic, that can, you know, handle this sort of high-level, high-profile case. And it will be of tremendous symbolic importance, even though, of course, the ideal is a purely domestic case. And in terms of your second point, that will be the case anyway. You know, dictators will try and stay in place for as long as they can. And there is nothing that can happen to change this overnight. This is something that will gradually happen as more and more, you know, sitting heads of state and even former heads of state are being tried. It's just that the process needs to be kicked off now, and South Africa actually put that process back by not arresting al-Bashir.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion. If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can still do so on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Recourse. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back as we discuss the trial of President Hissène Habré. I think I should also join into saying Habré because that's what Ottilia is saying down in Pretoria. And Ottilia, one of the questions you write, the judges have all been appointed by the African Union, and the chief judge in this case is from Burkina Faso, which has its own shares of problems.
That's definitely the case, and I think you know, it was really the crux of my point earlier, was that if we want to ensure that the impunity gap, as it were, is closed, that in encouraging processes like the Hissène Habré one, we must also encourage other sort of processes at a domestic level and potentially at a regional level. Now, when it comes to having a judge from another country, that's not something that's new. And you know, that the judge comes from Burkina Faso shouldn't necessarily go against him. You know, you can have impartial judges coming from countries that are currently in turmoil.
I noticed during the proceedings in the trial that was on the 20th of July, there was some support for Hissène Habré in the gallery.
Well, I'm sure it's a public gallery, so anybody's welcome. And I'm sure, you know, this was an opportunity for them to show their respect to their former leader. One cannot really control that, you know.
Let's take this call from Nkululeko from Gauteng. Nkululeko, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Thank you, sir. My concern is one about, especially about the African continent. Many of the presidents, I mean, like Mugabe and others, how will they be able to come with justice while they themselves, you know, have been accused for, you know, for the atrocities in Matabeleland. So I don't think Africa is ready to have its own justice system.
Thank you, Nkululeko. Probably I should throw that question to you, Ottilia from Nkululeko. And this issue of Matabeleland that happened in the early 80s after independence is still bubbling along in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, Nkululeko is obviously speaking about the infamous Gukurahundi massacres in Zimbabwe, which is also my home country. And there has been quite a lot in terms of controversy around, firstly, the fact that the atrocities were allegedly committed, and then also that the commission that was formed thereafter, the findings of that commission have still not been made public. So there are some serious concerns there. The issue that Nkululeko raises, which is around whether people who have not been held to account themselves can bring about justice, that is a very important question to raise, because it goes to the heart of whether or not our criminal justice systems are geared towards ensuring justice. But in many ways, it's quite important to bear in mind that there are some processes, and we cannot continue to say that there cannot be justice on the African continent. I think it's almost upon us to agitate for that justice in whatever form it can be.
We've spoken about the victims who brought this matter to court. But the problem is, can they participate in the court proceedings?
Well, the movement, the general international trend is to allow victims to participate. Certainly at the ICC, you know, this is possible, and I know in courts like the Chambers of Cambodia, Special Chambers of Cambodia, victims increasingly
in the Khmer Rouge case.
Yes, are speaking in the court and are attending in large numbers. As far as I understand, this process doesn't allow for as much victim participation, but the victims have participated in many other ways, in bringing evidence forward, in advocating for the case to take place. The victims have been active in other ways. I just don't see that within the court's proceedings itself, other than giving evidence, it would have victims would have an equally heavy role. But the evidence is actually so compelling that I don't see that as I do think that if the trial is fair, there is a very good chance that he'd be convicted. But as we know, these cases can continue for a very, very long time. There might be political interference, and these, it's not at all clear that it will go well.
My apologies for interrupting you. I just want to take this call from the Free State. Good afternoon and welcome to Rise and Recourse.
Afternoon, how are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. My comment is very brief. This case is very interesting, and we must show to the rest of the world that Africans can do something on their own. But the only thing that I'm worried about is that this issue is being pushed by Belgium. It was not an issue initiated by Africans themselves. That is only my comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nakari says the issue has been pushed by Belgium. I think the victims actually took up the issue, and they actually went to the Belgian government because now they had left Chad and they were staying in Belgium. That's my understanding. Ottilia?
You're right, Dimile, that's exactly the case. So while the matter was before Belgian institutions, it wasn't the Belgian authorities themselves that sought to initiate the process. And I think when speaking quite specifically around victim participation, you started off our engagement today with a clip with Reed Brody as well as Suleiman Gwengweng, who have been acting for the victims. But quite importantly, and in many ways, something that we don't have within the South African criminal justice system, as well as other countries that follow what is known as a common law system, is the engagement of victims as partie civile in the processes. Now, Senegal allows for victims to participate, not necessarily as sort of direct parties to the proceedings, but they do participate as partie civile. And this court allows for victim representation and allows for victims to be able to, at the very least, have part of their side of the story told.
The other question I want because we're quickly running out of time, and that is, can victims obtain reparations? And if so, who is likely to pay reparations? I know, though, I read somewhere that the government of Chad has actually helped some of the victims financially, but can they claim reparations?
Yes, surely. I mean, the reparations process, it doesn't have to start after the court case, but very often, it's triggered by a court case. But it doesn't have to be tied to the court case. It's just that, they shouldn't be too selective in who they award the reparations to, because that can cause all kinds of other disputes. So one good thing about, having a fair trial beforehand, if that is possible, if we're going to see that, is to at least have more of a sense of the number of victims, for example, and then to maybe start a reparations process that is more systematic and that is more, is more fair, and that would actually pay out on a larger scale.
Ottilia, do you want to come in there?
Yes, thank you. I think we have to make a distinction between financial restitution and a reparative justice where victims get reparations. Now, at the moment, in terms of reparative justice, for the most part, victims only get reparations as a result of a conviction. That Chad has been able to begin giving reparations has been really linked to the fact that Isena Abreu was prosecuted and convicted in absentia. But now the issue here is which victims and how much, what amounts to full reparation. For some victims, it's not about money. It's about being able to be restored to the place where you were at before the crime was committed.
Thank you very much, Ottilia. We're quickly running out of time. Thank you very much. My apologies. There is a need to temper with the expectations of what the Harbour trial can and will deliver. The fact that the trial is even happening is momentous in its own right, but justice invariably faces an uphill battle, and it is unfair to victims and survivors to raise the expectation of what the trial can deliver. Moreover, to be legitimate now and in future, fair trial standards must be guaranteed. A conviction cannot be a foregone conclusion, while the heavy lifting of setting up the African Chamber Extraordinaire and putting Harbour in the dock has finally been achieved. This has been Rights and Recourse. This program is repeated at 10 tonight and at 5 on Monday morning. Thank you to our guests, and from all of us here in the studio, good afternoon.